بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خير خلق الله خاتم الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين. Brothers and sisters جميعا, السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. We send our condolences to the Muslim Ummah, and in particular our 12th Imam, on the anniversary of the martyrdom of his father, Imam al-Hasan al-Askari, and we ask Allah to hasten the reappearance of the 12th Imam. On this sad occasion, we want to frame our discussion with discussions concerning the role of Imam Hasan al-Askari and the effect of the preparations of the Imam for the early and mid ghaiba period, which covers the minor ghaiba, the ghaiba sughra, and covers the early years of al-ghaiba al-kubra. These are the years that we find the Ithna Ashari school being the most active in terms of seminal works, in terms of works that we rely upon till today. It is also the period that some people who have studied Islamic history have said that the Imamis faced a crisis, so to speak, and relied upon certain individuals to rescue the madhab, that they were unprepared for the ghaiba, and it needed the efforts of certain individuals to set the madhab on a right course. And inshallah we will come to particular replies on according to this discussion. Now it's important to recognize that Imam al-Hasan al-Askari himself set the agenda. So he in one of his most famous ahadith says, after the ghaiba, turn to the narrators of our hadith. Now in those days, the narrators of hadith weren't people who only narrated hadith. Yes, there were some individuals who were not scholars in their own right, but narrations were taken from them. But what the Imam is saying here is, turn to the narrators of hadith that are also the scholars. And that means the people who are capable of giving fatwa, which means the people who we term today as fuqaha. It is the etiquette till today, when we look at the works of the fuqaha, that I think nearly every single one of them has an ijazah. Ijazat rawaya, they call it. The ijazah to carry on transmission. I've seen some of them from the modern day scholars, and if you were to follow the ijazah, you will see that it goes back to Sheikh al-Saduq, for example. Through various chains, handed down one to the other, it goes back more than 1,100 years. And Sheikh al-Saduq then also says, these are my mashayikh. So when we look at, for example, Sheikh Saduq's works, Sheikh al-Tusi's works, they say at the beginning of their works, these are our mashayikh, these are the people that we narrate from. They list. So they say when we narrate the hadith later on, sometimes we don't list a chain for each hadith because we are relying upon these individuals. So we don't need to keep repeating. Don't forget, in those days, they used a lot of shorthand because ink was very rare. Scrolls for you to be able to write on record was also very expensive to get hold of. The fact that if you could condense something meant that it was less likely to get lost. And also because of the political friction of the time, you tended to write in code or shorthand. So some of our later scholars had the difficult task of decoding what the earlier scholars wrote, particularly their use of certain terms when they were describing someone's madhab, for example. If he was part of the mainstream, if he was a mughali, for example, or a muqassir, they used to use various terms that later scholars were able to decode for us. So the Imam in his hadith, when he says turn to the narrators of our hadith, means actually turn to the narrators who are scholars. And this setting of the agenda was very, very important because the ghaiba period started in a way suddenly. The Imam, while he had prepared people for being distant from the 12th Imam, they were not expecting how difficult of a challenge this would be, even though we have incidences where, for example, Imam al-Sadiq was called away by Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, the Abbasid Khalifa. So they lost contact with the Imam for a while. Even though we had Imam Musa al-Kadhim being in prison for a few years, they lost contact with him. Even though technically Imam al-Rida was taken to be put under house arrest, technically, people lost contact for a short while with the Imam. Later on we see, for example, Imam Ali al-Hadi and Imam Hassan al-Askari were, as we've described before, put in an army base, so to speak, in today's language. And they were surrounded by soldiers in order to cut them off from the modern world. We see that various periods occurred, but suddenly to have no way to access the Imam apart from these four individuals meant that the Ummah in its Imami definition suddenly had no access to the source of legislation, to the source of Islamic knowledge, to the source of the basis of their madhab. And so the Imam had trained people during his lifetime to rely on the fuqaha. Some of the most famous of them were, for example, one or two of the Nawabs, the four deputies. Some were very famous during their lifetime of the Imams as being fuqaha. For example, Yunus ibn Abdul Rahman, Zurara, for example, in the lifetime of Imam as-Sadiq, for example. These were people who gave fatwa, and the Imams relied on them while the Imams were alive, that these scholars would give fatwa. We have incidences where, for example, in the Hajj season, the Imams focused very much on trying to be part of the Hajj season. We have narrations that say Imam Hassan al-Askari went to Hajj 35 times. We have the later Imams, going to the Hajj dozens of times. They focused very much because the Hajj was a conference. You had people from all backgrounds, people who were notionally enemies. For example, people who resided in Sham, who had a particular view of the Imamis or the Imams themselves. And this was an opportunity to correct some of that understanding. You had people who just had become Muslims, and this was a way in which to reach out to these new Muslims and explain ideas to them. It was also a period where you would respond to challenges. If a new school, for example, had come up and said there is total free will, there is total tafweed, Allah has given all will of things to humans to act upon whatever they do. He interferes none at all. And the opposite, the extreme opposite, the people who became later known as the Jabriya, the people who believed in total predestination, that this is what Allah wills. I am commanded to do this, not directly by communication, but Allah has manufactured things in such a way that I am bound to do so and so. And the Imams would use these occasions, for example, the Hajj season, to respond to these various ideologies. And during one of these Hajj seasons, Imam Sadiq was sitting with a group of his companions, preaching to some of these Muslims, and one of the men approached him who was an atheist. He did not believe in a creator, did not believe in a one God. And he said, I wish to debate with you, pointing at the Imam. In front of the Imam's companions, he pointed at him and said, I heard you are the most knowledgeable here, I wish to debate with you. And it is said the Imam replied and says to Hisham, patting on his back, go, you debate with him. And it is the Imam saying that Hisham, whatever Hisham says, represents our views, the Imams of the Ahl Bayt. We agree with what he says. And this occurred in more than one incident. Hisham, for example, challenged someone in Kufa, he challenged someone in Basra, he challenged someone later on in Medina. And every time the Imam would say, you are blessed by the Ruh. Allah has spoken through you. So though you are not a ma'soom, though you are not an Imam, Allah has made His message come out through your mouth. And this showed that there was a reliance on, for example, here we're talking about Aqeedah, on someone who's going to speak about Ilm al-Kalam. In other incidences, we see their dependence on people who are going to give fatwa, going to give fiqh opinions. And this was again during the lifetime of the Imams. We see, for example, during the lifetime of Imam al-Kadhim, he used to ask for example, the huquq to be given to certain people. He was in prison, he was not able to receive some of these funds. At the same time, he said, whenever queries come in, also forward them to these, and he listed certain people that would receive the huquq to answer your questions. In certain occasions, the same people that answered those questions would come to the Imam to seek an answer, as we see today. If we write a question to the faqih, the majority of the questions are answered by a committee who understand fully the methodology of the faqih. They answer on his behalf. In certain circumstances, when the question is, for example, particularly difficult or there is no precedent, they return back to the faqih himself. And we have examples of when these individuals, these wukala, these representatives, went back to the Imam himself. Somehow managed to get to the prison where the Imam was and get a message to him and say, here's a particular issue, how do we respond? And they would be able to respond to the people or whoever gave the istiftah, whoever gave the question. So it is clear to see that Imam Hassan Askari set the agenda of saying, this will be a difficult time. You will report yourselves to the Nawab and to the Fuqaha. Particularly his mention is on the Fuqaha because the Nawab stage, the time where you have the 4 deputies was limited. The Ghaiba Sughra was some 70 years. It's a limited period of time. So he understood that the people would want to know further ahead how much for later generations, 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years, till today's, who would be the people that we turn to? And that is why he framed his answer in this way, that we turn to the narrators of hadith, i.e. the fuqaha. And we, as we've explained, the scholars became important, particularly after the re-emergence of the madhab on the international stage, so to speak, during the lifetime of Imam al-Sadiq. This period between the fall of the Banu Umayyah and the rise of Banu al-Abbas gave a bit of respite to the Imams who were based in Medina. Followers were attracted to Medina, and the school began to expand in terms of the number of people reaching it, and also in terms of recognition of the school. There were some people who were resident in North Africa who did not hear of the Imams. And it was during this period, the fall of Banu Umayyah, the rise of Banu Abbas, this period between the years of 124, 125, 130 Hijri, until the beginning of Abu Ja'far Mansur's grip on power, which is the year 142, 141 Hijri. This 10 to 15 year period, the Imams were able to attract lots and lots of people. And they were able to send them back to their various towns. They were able to send them back to the countries that they came from. Some were non-Arabs, of course. Some were from other madhabs that turned to the Imam madhab. They would send them back and say, go and preach to your people. So Hisham was one of the people that was sent back. He did not live in Medina for the rest of his life. The Imam said, go back to where you've come from and preach to the people. And so we see the role of the fuqaha and the scholars becomes important in the lifetime of Imam al-Sadiq and takes on a greater role. Because after this period of when the madhab, let's say, is stronger and is politically less aggrieved, during the lifetime of Imam al-Kadhim, it becomes much more difficult, the conditions. During Imam Jawad's time, during Imam Hassan al-Askari's time, it becomes much less free for them to expound on their beliefs. So the role of the scholars was recognized and built upon in the lifetime of the Imams. The ghaiba-like circumstances, as we've described, an example was when Imam al-Kadhim was in prison. There was no direct access to the Imams. There was no opportunity for you to hear it from the source. You had to rely upon representatives. And this is in a way very similar to the Ghaiba Sughra, where you had no direct communication with the Imam and needed to rely upon representatives who would be able to either act on behalf of the Imam or communicate from the Imam. And this is important because it shows that the Imams told the people or informed the people that you may rely on others to give our opinions and to give our views. Certain individuals, not everyone. And that's why we see in certain ahadith, they were also very condemning of the Dajjal in the multiple personality sense, not the Dajjal at the end of time. The Dajjals that would come from the lifetime of Imam al-Mahdi at the beginning of the Ghaiba or throughout time. We see, for example, the Imams also mention the people who falsely claim to be the Mahdi or falsely claim to be in communication with the Mahdi. And that is why the 12th Imam writes a very stern letter to the final deputy and says, Ali ibn Muhammad al-Samari, and he says to him, do not appoint anyone after you. He's very, very clear in this. And he says, proclaim this letter, your death is in a few days. And this begins the larger or the longer period of Ghaiba. He was very, very clear to make public that there would be no more representatives, there would be no authorized persons on behalf of the Imams. And this is also mentioned in the hadith, that they condemn anyone who claims to act on behalf of the Imam. We have in our narrations, people who claim to be in communication with the Imam are cursed. People who claim to see the Imams are cursed, with qualifications. There are certain qualifications to the statement, but there are ahadith to this effect, that the people who come out in modern day terms and say, I'm in communication with the Imam, I have seen the Imam, I know where he is, for example, I'm able to reach out to him, I'm able to hear from him, are cursed by the Imams themselves. They were very strict about this point because it is something that could be abused. And we have, unfortunately, in today's world, we have some groups. There are some people I'm aware of here in the UK. There are some people, unfortunately, based in modern day Iraq in the south, who claim to be in communication, direct or indirect, with the 12th Imam, to be able to reach out to him, and they are representatives. One of them has even called himself Al-Yamani, who is mentioned in the hadith as coming at the end of time and being one of the forerunners to the reappearance of the 12th Imam. There is someone now residing in South Iraq who proclaims himself as Al-Yamani. And so the Imams understood that this would pose a risk for today's Shi'i, for today's Imami, if they did not put a criteria for who would be their representative, who not. And the only known representatives of the Imams are the 4 deputies. After that, we cannot accept anyone to be acting on behalf of the Imams directly, and for anyone to say, I'm in communication with the Imams. And so the circumstances that occurred in the lifetime of Imam al-Kadhim give us good precedence and understanding. Some of the people became, I'm sure some of you have delved into history, became Waqifi, which means they observed the first 6 Imams, and upon the death of Imam as-Sadiq, said, right, we do not believe in a 7th Imam, or we do not believe in the Imamah of Musa al-Kadhim. We will abstain from giving the bay'ah. Largely when the scholars of Rijal, because they're interested in people's beliefs in terms of their veracity and truthfulness, when they've studied this Waqifi period, the majority of them became Waqifi for about 60 days, 2 months, and then they reverted back to the correct belief. There were a few that were cursed and by the Imams because they refused to return to the correct belief. Some of them were accused of taking the huquq, and for this reason they became Waqifi, because they received a large sum of money and they did not wish to give it back to the Imam and his correct representatives. They wanted to hold on to it. And again, this is circumstances that in today's age we can relate to. It is in our beliefs that when the faqih dies, when the marja in today's language dies, his hujjah ceases to exist. The strength of his opinions disappears in terms of action. His followers must seek recourse to a living faqih to ask permission, if the living faqih approves, that they refer back to the dead or deceased faqih. If not, if he does not approve, then they cannot maintain the taqleed, the following of the previous faqih. They cannot act upon his opinions. His opinions become technically worthless unless the living faqih approves. There are a few dissenting ulama who don't follow this opinion. They allow the following of a dead faqih. But the majority of our school says that when a faqih dies, that's it. His opinions are of no value technically to the muqallid unless he refers to a living faqih. And this is an important point because we see in today's world some representatives of fuqaha, the faqih has been dead 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and they act as if the faqih is still alive, still giving the opinions, still giving the fatawa, still collecting the huquq. And we say, well, we need to investigate. Is there a living faqih that approves of this? If not, then that faqih who is dead, then we have to investigate how you representatives are taking advantage of this situation. It is something that the modern ummah faces. So the periods before the minor ghaibah were also challenging. We should perhaps look into it. This Waqifi period, unfortunately, is a lot of... it's a very short period, but it's a lot of confusion surrounding it. It's quite complex, because some of the individuals were very much praised by the Imams. Suddenly we see the Imams cursing them. It is also a period when the Banu Abbas were particularly strong, because it is the fall of Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, it is the rise of Muhammad al-Mahdi, his son, and later on Harun al-Rashid. And this period, the Banu Abbas were particularly strong, and they were very keen to limit the Imami school. So they would send people, for example, to test the opinions of the fuqaha to see if they were pro-state or anti-state. We have an example in Ali ibn Yaqtin. Maybe you have heard of him. He is written in a letter by the Imam that tomorrow do wudu and do prayer according to the other madhab, not to our madhab. Don't do it according to the Imami madhab. Ali ibn Yaqtin is one of the people that works for the Abbasid government. This is during the lifetime of Harun al-Rashid. But he is an Imami. But he has made sure to try not to be too open about his religion. At the same time, he is still a follower of the Imam. He's known to be a follower of the Imam. And so there is a particular agenda set against him in Harun Rashid's court to out, in a way, Ali ibn Yaqtin and to have him put in prison, in trouble, because he's a follower of the Imam. And so the Imam warns him and says, tomorrow do the wudu and do the salah the way the khalifin do it, not the way al-khasa do it. And so Ali ibn Yaqtin performs according to the Imam. He does his wudu. At that very same time, one of the people who's instigating against Ali ibn Yaqtin asks Harun Rashid to come and observe this man's wudu, because you can tell from his wudu that he is not from Ahl al-Amma, he is a follower of the Imams. And at that moment in time, Ali ibn Yaqin doesn't know he's being observed, but he's followed the commands of the Imam. He does his wudu and his prayer in the way of Ahl al-Amma. And so Harun Rashid sees, actually he's not praying in the way the Ahl al-Khassa do, and he says, someone has instigated me against you, I've put them in trouble, but I know you're one of the people who are loyal to us. So during the lifetime of the Imams, the Banu Abbas were trying to send people, it happened in the lifetime of Imam al-Rida, Imam al-Kadhim, to go and speak to the Imams, or to become a student of their circle, to learn. It happened, for example, in the story of Muslim ibn Aqil, where Ubaydullah bin Ziyad sent someone who took some money and said, I'm a follower of you, Muslim, and it managed to penetrate the inner circle. This happened many times. So the Imams at various times had to protect some of their companions. So this period, this Waqif period, is actually very complex to decode. What is the Imam really trying to say here? So we know for a fact that Zurara Ibn A'yun is one of the closest people to the Imams. He is one of our greatest scholars. We have a hadith from Imam Sadiq that curse Zurara. Curse him in a very frank and open way. Curses upon Zurara. Some of our ulama have delved into the circumstances of when this was uttered, why this was uttered. And they've managed to find out that actually this was a period of time when Zurara was under investigation and was wanted by the Abbasid state. So when they came to the circle of the companions of the Imam, they wanted to arrest them. Zurara was one of them. When this person who was in charge of the secret police or the person in charge of arresting Zurara hears Imam al-Sadiq cursing Zurara, he says, well, we've got the wrong man, because he is saying publicly that he's distancing himself from this person. He is saying that this person is condemned. So how can he be one of the followers of Imam al-Sadiq if openly in a majlis, in a gathering, Imam al-Sadiq is cursing him? And so in this way, Zurara's life was saved. So some of our scholars have delved into this difficult period and actually found out what the intention of the Imams were and what they were trying to do. So this Waqif period, as I say, is a bit complex. For people who are interested, I would mostly recommend the work of the ulama of Rijal, because this is their job. This is what they try to do. Try to find out if a particular person was alive at that time, what his job was, where he was residing, what his madhab was like, what other people said from him, who he communicated from, who did he communicate to. So the ulama of Rijal actually give us a very good insight to some of these people's character. One of the things that occurred in the Ghaiba period was the cementing, if you want to put it, or the expounding of the Imami beliefs. Why this occurred? Because in the lifetime of the Imams, there were books written. We have, for example, the Usul al-Arba'miyah, which are from the lifetime of Imam al-Sadiq to the lifetime of Imam Hassan al-Askari. There was a period in which their companions wrote books on every field. Aqaid, even politics, science, in terms of natural sciences, the physical sciences, Islamic sciences, tafsir, adab, all branches. They were collected and they were found to be roughly 400 works. Some of the scholars say slightly more, some will say slightly less, but it became famous for al-Usul al-Arba'miyah, the 400 fundamental works. And it is said these 400 works were approved by the Imams themselves. They were written by their closest companions. And this explained the Imami school in all its forms for an audience. Unfortunately, from the Usul al-Arba'miyah today, very few survive. Maybe a couple of dozen, not more than that. We would say less than 100 survive. Some parts of the others have been reproduced in other works. For example, Shaykh al-Tusi reproduces parts in some of his works, very small parts, or Sayyid ibn Tawus, of one of the works of Usul al-Arba'miyah. But today, as an independent work, we have only a couple of dozen that remain. The rest, unfortunately, have not survived due to various events in history that meant none of the works were able to fall into the correct hands. And so, when, for example, the Ghaiba occurred, we had a lack of literature. This was for the reason that, as I mentioned, the works were lost, the previous works. The second reason was, how much of a need was there for work if the Imam was still alive? Would you need to write a work of tafsir if the Imam was standing over there and you could just get from him? Would you, as a scholar, need to sit and write an author and try to deduct when the original source was standing next to you? Fiqh, would you need to sit and try to give lessons on usul and have one of your students write a taqrir, a report, and gather it when the original source of tashri' is standing there? He gives you the fatwa without the need for usul. And so that's also caused a lack of literature in the Imami school, because the scholars themselves saw no need to write so many works and use their own ijtihad when the living Imam was there. And so when the Ghaibah came, we lacked much more of what the other schools had. Why? Because the other schools were without the original source for 300 years, 250 years, 200 years, 400 years. Because the year 11th Hijri notionally ends the source of tashri', legislation. With the death of the Prophet in the year 11 Hijri, after that becomes the period on which they need to rely on either the companions or the first generation or the tabi'een, the later generations, the followers of the first generation, people who heard from the people that met the Prophet. They became some of the key scholars. They had to rely upon people like Malik ibn Anas, for example, who was someone that resided in Medina 120 years after the death of the Prophet. He became a source of legislation. We are looking at the year 255, 260, and later on in the major Ghaibah, we're looking at the year 330 onwards. That means the other school has had a 200, 300 year period in which they needed to write these works because they lost the source of legislation, and the Imami school has just entered that phase when they need to start collecting these works because their source of legislation has just passed away. So that is a reason for the need for the scholars at this Ghaibah period to start writing. And also firstly, because some of the works were lost due to various actions. One of them, for example, the library of Sabur ibn Ardashir, the library of Sayyid al-Murtada, the library of Shaykh Tusi, between them almost 250,000 works. Imagine 250,000, 250,000 books were lost in the year 447 Hijri. The entrance of Tughr al-Beg, who was part of the Seljuk Empire, into Baghdad, bringing down the previous Buwayhid regime, and a general mob that attacked libraries, and they ransacked and burnt 250,000 books. And so of course there was suddenly, and the move of Shaykh Tusi from Baghdad to Najaf meant that he moved to Najaf with, as the scholars say, only with the clothes on his back. He was not able to take his library with him. He was not able to take his works with him. He had to recount some of them by memory to some of his students. And so this period means the Shia in a way have to start from scratch. The Imam is not there. Their works have been burnt, taken away, confiscated. And so there is a need for them to start writing before things are lost. Now, the issue of communication with the other school. The other schools were not one. The opinions say that at the time the Ash'ari school became most dominant, which is roughly the year 500 Hijri. There were more than 300 schools of Ahl al-Amma. Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, the famous author of Tabari, had his own school of tafsir, of fiqh, of kalam. He was a person who had his own madhab. He was no less than Abu Hanifa and Malik. Yet today, when we look at the schools, we recognize 4 from Ahl al-Amma. The scholars who have looked at kalam have said there were roughly 300 of these schools, but they were filtered down to these 4. So there was a tremendous rise in the number of schools from the other, from the non-imamis, let's say. And this meant also that the imamis needed to produce their works, needed to communicate to the other schools or to the general populace what their beliefs were. Also, my point is there was an Islamization of the state. You might think that's a bit funny because, well, it's supposed to be a Khalifa system anyway. They're supposed to be Islamic. But actually, largely, as we know, unfortunately, through history, that the Umayyad Khalifa was non-Islamic. They maybe used the term Khalifa, but their actions, the way they behaved, even forbidding, for example, hadith, forbidding public preaching. The first time someone was able to preach in public was in roughly the year 100 Hijri, Al-Hasan al-Basri. Before then, nobody was allowed to preach or teach publicly in a public gathering. Al-Hasan al-Basri was the first scholar authorized by the state to begin preaching. And even then, his preaching was, we'll say, popular. It wasn't meant to be to the depth and level of later scholars as Imam Sadiq, for example. It was meant just to give general guidance to the people. The people who spoke at Friday prayers, the khutbah they gave was largely in praise of the Khalifa and some verses from the Quran, and ends with cursing of those who oppose the Khalifa. It wasn't actually a lecture or a lesson or something that you could benefit from and learn. So even the khutbahs they gave weren't meant to really be that much full of Islamic knowledge. And the early Abbasid government was likely the same. But the change was during the time of Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, he recognized that this was a danger, that if the number of schools continued to grow, and if the number of opinions continued to grow, eventually one of them will be stronger than the one the government wants, and that stronger one will be anti-government. And this was a threat during the Umayyad period. Ghaylan al-Dimashqi and Ma'bad al-Juhani, two people who were executed, student and teacher, believed that man had free will. Now, exactly whether they believed in total free will or not is not very clear, but they were executed in Damascus because they went against the state theology that said actually man is forced. So when I kill you, it's not my fault. Allah wills it. When I rule over you, it's not my fault. Allah wills it. When I've slaughtered Al-Hussein and his companions, I haven't done anything wrong. Allah commands it. Allah wishes it. Allah wants it in this way. So this was a good ideology for the state. It was bad for the people. Ma'bad al-Juhani, Ghaylan Dimashqi were the two of the earliest people who said, actually, no such thing. You are not compelled to do things. There is free will, and they were executed for their beliefs. So this was a danger that a school could rise and potentially topple the government. What did Abu Ja'far al-Mansur do? He went to Medina and he visited Malik ibn Anas, and he said to Malik, I want you to write a book. And in those days, you write a book of fiqh using hadith, rather than today, which is mostly based on deductions, also the opinions of previous scholars and so on, methodology that the scholars of fiqh use. In those days, it was mainly based on hadith. He said, I wish for you to write a book of fiqh because we want the nation, the ummah, to turn to a work, a source, a reference. And the first authorized work, this is the year, brothers and sisters, 150 Hijri. That means the Prophet has been dead 140 years. This is the first time a book has been allowed to be printed. 140 years of banning of narrations, of communication publicly, of preaching to the people, of passing on the sciences of the Holy Prophet. Suddenly now it's going to be authorized. Not open for everyone, only Malik was privileged to do so. And his work is called Al-Muwatta. Al-Muwatta. It is a work of fiqh based on hadith. This is the first authorized work. 140 years there was banning of authoring books and publishing and narrating. Abdullah bin Abbas complains to Muawiyah. He says, your men have come to me and have stopped me from, he writes a letter to Muawiyah. He says, they've stopped me from preaching. Do you prevent us from preaching and teaching the Quran? He says, no. Muawiyah replies, no. He says, do you prevent us from explaining it? He says, yes. You can recite, you can say some general, but to explain to people exactly what? No, I'm not going to allow that. Because what you're going to explain is not what we want to explain from the Quran. So this was a period from 150 years Hijri, is when I believe there was an Islamization of the state. Ma'mun, for example, was very keen to show that he wasn't a barbarian. He was actually one of the most learned of the Bani Abbas, culturally very adept. He had works of fiqh himself, his opinions that he gathered from various scholars. He had his own kalam opinions. When the debates used to occur with Imam Rada present, he used to have his own opinion on things. So I believe this period meant that there was the Islamization of the state, and there was more of a need for our scholars to write these various works. Also, when the Ghaiba begins, the other schools have a language terminology that they use. One of the sciences that they have is Al-Adl wa Tajrih, which we refer to as Ilm al-Rijal. There is already a science developed by the other schools for recognizing who is a truthful person. Can he have narrated from this other person? And then looking also at the hadith itself, Ilm al-Daraya we call it, looking at what this hadith says. Now, our scholars, because the living source of legislation was there, did not need to use Ilm al-Rijal. They weren't going to investigate Imam al-Hadi and ask if he was truthful or not. There was no need, because we believe he is the Imam. They weren't going to ask Imam Rada, where did you get this hadith from? Because Imam Rada, in his journey to Mashhad or Tus in those days, he goes through one of the most famous towns of those days, and is stopped by large numbers of people. And they ask him, can you say something to us? And he says, I heard from my father, from his father As-Sadiq, from his father Al-Baqir, from his father Zayn al-Abidin, from his father Al-Hussein, from Amir al-Mu'mineen, from the Holy Prophet, from Jibreel. And this is known as the golden chain of narration. So there was no need for the Imami school to have ilm al-rijal, because there was no need to investigate where the Imams got their hadith from. Now, when the ghaibah occurred and the scholars were writing the hadith, then there was a need for us to verify, where did this scholar get this hadith from? Who has he heard it from? Now, there was a need to be able to give this work to someone who is non-imami for him to understand. The only way they could do that is if the terminology, if the language was similar. So that is why our scholars began to use some of the terms the other schools used. For example, we know that the international language of medicine is English. Otherwise, or sometimes Latin in various terms. In biology, it is Latin. Whenever people want to look at a species, for example, they want to look at the characteristics of a creature, they look at the Latin terms. Otherwise, if everyone followed their own terminology, scientists would not be able to communicate with each other. There would be a big problem. You wouldn't be able to have conferences, you wouldn't be able to have journals. If someone was trying to prescribe something to someone else in the other country would not be able to understand it. But most of you have had this experience. Someone in one country can write his prescription in English. You give it to someone here in the UK, they're able to act upon it, yes? Or medical reports. You take it from here, you give it to someone who's the other side of the world, they'll understand it, no problem, because there is one common language here. Likewise, the followers of the Imams needed to do the same thing. They needed to write in a language that the other sides, the other schools could understand. Otherwise, there would be a lack of communication. And so they began to write things and categorize them and classify them in a similar way that the other schools could understand. So when they began to write on Usul al-Fiqh, why? Because Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i had written Al-Risala fil Usul in the year 208 Hijri. So when Sheikh At-Tusi, for example, Abu Ja'far At-Tusi writes in the year 430, 440, writes Udda fil Usul. He has to use similar terminology to a Shafi'i who came 240 years before in order for the other schools to understand the terms. Otherwise, there would be no international language. So that was also a reason why our scholars began to write more and more. There is unfortunately a school today, I wouldn't call it Orientalist, but the academics based in universities who call this period of ghaibah, they call it crisis. The Imamis were plunged into crisis, their Imam was gone, and they suffered in this period. They didn't have much works. The other schools had works and scholars and sciences developed. This school was underdeveloped, and there was a huge crisis. And that is why suddenly 3-4 key figures stepped in to explain the school and to cement its reputation and to give people actually solid grounding in what the Imami madhab is. I obviously don't accept this. I believe this is short-sighted. I believe that they haven't looked into the details of when these challenging periods occurred, as we explained in the time of Imam al-Kadhim, for example, in the time of the other Imams, and they've not taken into account that these other factors, that the scholars found a need to actually tell people, hey, the madhab that we had in the Imam, we need to start writing it in a book. Before we relied on the Imam, now it needs to be written in a book. Not that we're not sure about our madhab, we need to start writing the madhab from scratch. No such thing. Instead, all it was a matter of documentation. I've recently begun a project collecting some incidents and stories from Iraq in the 70s, because the people who were in those events are now 65, 70 years old. I'm worried that we might lose some of their stories, and they're first-hand witnesses, first eyewitnesses to some important events in history. And I'm now recently began to record by audio their statements, because later generations will not get a chance otherwise. This is exactly what occurred in this early ghaibah period. Sheikh al-Saduq, Sheikh al-Mufid, Sayyid al-Murtada, Sheikh al-Tusi began to document the madhab, lest there be a period too far between the Imam's time and the earlier period. Sheikh al-Saduq, he writes, and he's proud of writing, that he says about himself, I was born at the dua of the 12th Imam, because his father had met Imam al-Hasan al-Askari, and complained to the Imam that I don't have a son. So the Imam prayed. It is said that he would have a son. And his son was born eventually, Sheikh al-Saduq. And this was the dua of the Imam. So we have, in our opinions, that all that was needed was time for the madhab to disappear. Ghaibah begins 260 Hijri. If by 350, 360, we haven't recorded the details of the madhab, the later generation would be at a loss. And that is why we have Al-Kafi written in the year 300 or published in the year 320 Hijri roughly. 9 years roughly before the death of Sheikh Al-Kulaini. Because he was one of the people who met the Nawab, met the companions of the Imams. If he hadn't written that work, that means we've lost somebody key, and the next generation there would be no direct link between this generation and the Imam. We'd lose a link. That is why it was important for us to document at that period of time. And so when we look at what Sheikh Al-Kulaini, Sheikh Al-Saduq, Sheikh Al-Mufid, Sayyid Al-Murtada, Sheikh Al-Tusi, these great scholars, what they did was not to concoct a madhab. Rather, they documented before it was lost. And so, returning back to tonight's remembrance, Imam Al-Hasan Al-Askari Salamullah had a key role in preparing the imamis for this period, and the ghaibah circumstances, similar circumstances occurred in the lifetime of the Imams, and the madhab was the same as it was. The only thing that was required was that the scholars document it. So Shaykh al-Mufid did not add anything from himself. Rather, he tried to document what the correct beliefs were, which is why he even wrote a work called Tasheeh al-I'tiqad, the correction of the beliefs. Because the Shaykh al-Saduq, his teacher, had wrote a work called al-I'tiqad, which is the beliefs of the Shia, and Shaykh al-Mufid, his student, wrote a work correcting some of the various points that Shaykh al-Saduq made. So rather than making a madhab, it was only to preserve what was there. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين.
You have some time for questions, if there are any, from either side.
Assalamu alaikum, Sajad. Thank you very much. That was very insightful, fantastic knowledge, mashallah. How does all this link in with Wilayat al-Faqih? I know it's obviously very controversial, but did Imam Hasan Askari give any insight into the role of scholars after these four representatives of the Imam?
So Imam Hasan Askari's hadith is more actually in terms of religious guidance on the scholarly level. So fiqh, aqaid, and so on, tafsir, in terms of turning to the narrations of hadith and scholars. The scholars who make a case for extensive wilayat al-faqih that can lead to a scholar leading a government and managing a government, so to speak, and appointing people to various positions and ensuring that government acts according to Islamic principles. Probably the strongest hadith they rely on is called Maqbulat Umar ibn Hanbala, which is the hadith which is maqbul, which isn't the highest grading of hadith, but it is maqbul, it's accepted hadith. We have gradings for a hadith, and one of them is maqbul. It means the hadith is accepted, but it's not the most flawless in terms of chains and the amount of people that narrated the hadith. And it is narrated by Umar ibn Hanbala, who was one of the companions of Imam al-Sadiq. One of the Qajari Shahs of Iran, the turn of the 20th century, says if Umar ibn Hanbala was alive today, I'd hang him because of this hadith. The hadith, basically the effect of this hadith, because he was being challenged by the scholars at that time, the constitutionalist scholars who believed that there needed to be a limit on the reign of the Shah and the scholars needed to intervene and begin to correct the course of the government to make it more Islamic and to limit the total power of the king, technically the Shah of the time. So this hadith of Umar ibn Hanbala is the basis of Walayat Fiqh. That is the hadith that talks about the scholars, talks about the representatives, if you will, of the Imams being more than just people who give opinions of fiqh, that may act in the best interests of the ummah, that may act on behalf of the Imam in terms of political or otherwise leadership, in terms of how they deal with people. But it depends on the reading of the hadith. It isn't something that is absolutely clear in saying definitely after us the 12 Imams or after the ghaib of the 12th Imam, we authorize every scholar out there to act upon our wishes and to be able to command people in all forms, not just to give them religious opinions. It isn't that clear, that hadith. And some of the scholars, Sayyid al-Khomeini being the most prominent, are the people that have read a direct interpretation of saying, yes, this authorizes the fuqaha to say, right, if you get a chance, you will go out and run, and it's technically an Islamic government. But like I said, it's not such an easy understanding of the hadith. It requires skills. But certainly Imam Hassan al-Askari was more, in that hadith, was more concerned with pointing people towards religious doctrine.
Any other questions from inside? I think we'll end there. Thank you very much. Salawat.